Well, we're in chapter 32 for next Sunday. If you, it would be good for you to finish out chapter 31 if you want to bring your classes up to speed as far as what happened with Laban. Some might have done that in your classes today, some might not have. But then chapter 32 goes in with Jacob now. Laban's gone back home. Jacob is getting set to go forward into the land of Canaan. And what's his one fear?
Esau.
Yeah, Esau.
Yeah.
Esau is his fear. What is going to happen? You know, does my brother still hold it against me? Is he wanting to finish me off? And so the first part of chapter 32 is going to talk about his preparation. And so because of his fear, he decides to do a couple things that are interesting. He decides that he sends messengers to Esau to announce that he's coming back and he wants to be, hopefully everything's okay. The messengers come back and tell Jacob, said, hey, Esau received us and he wants to come and see you. And he's bringing 400 guys with him. Which, once again, is not alleviating the fear that Jacob has. He doesn't know if Esau is coming with the 400 men to kill him, which he promised to do when Jacob left 20 years before. So as a result, he decides to divide his family and his herds into two separate groups. And so he's thinking, well, if Esau attacks one, maybe the other one will get through. I'm sure that he probably sent Leah and her kids first, and then sent Rachel and her family another way, just to make it possibly saving Rachel and her family. But the interesting thing too is that Jacob decides to send peace offerings. He divides up some of his flocks and he sends peace offerings. And he sends them in waves. And he said, when you come to Esau, he tells the first guy, he said, when you come to Esau, say, this is a present from your brother Jacob. And he hopes all is well. And each wave, he tells the leader of that wave to say the same thing. These are for you, Esau. He's trying to grease the wheel, and hopefully things will be well. But the interesting thing about chapter 32, in the summary, is that Jacob prays in verses 9 through 12. And the interesting thing, he mentions the fact of the God of his grandfather Abraham, the God of his father Isaac. But then he begins to mention some of the things that God promised him. It's always good to, in our prayer life, to mention the promises of God, what he has promised. Not that we need to remind God, but we need to remind ourselves. And this is what I think that Jacob was doing. He said, listen, you promised this, and you promised that. Lord, fulfill your promises. Now, as we get into the verses we're going to look at, verses 24 through 32, we see that the big idea is that God transforms people for use in his divine plan. God is going to take Jacob's life and is going to transform his life for his use. Up to this point, Jacob has, ever since he left Bethel, when he had that dream of the angels descending on that staircase, we see that his life has been different, but still, he has not really developed and nurtured that relationship that God wants with him. But today we look into this and we pick it up in verse 24. And Jacob was left alone. He sent everybody on. He stayed back. This is just before he's going to cross over into the land of Canaan. And God needs to transform Jacob's life. And so we see the wrestling match that takes place in verse 24 through 26. Said that a man wrestled with Jacob until the breaking of the day. Theologians like to talk about who was this man. Some say it was an angel of the Lord. Some say it was a Christophanies, or an Old Testament appearing of the pre-incarnate Christ. From what we can gather in this section, it would seem that God is wrestling with Jacob. In verse 25, and when he saw that he prevailed not against him, now, it's preposterous to think that that Jacob could fend off God, and to win the battle. God could have ended this wrestling match before it ever began, okay? But there was a reason that God was allowing this wrestling match to take place. He was wanting to do a work in Jacob's life. And we see that finally in this match, he touches Jacob's thigh and puts it out of joint. And so he wrestled with him, and Jacob tries, when he realizes who he's wrestling with, he hangs on for dear life. He prevailed. And the interesting thing about it was that God could have ended it at any time, but what he was doing, he was trying to get Jacob to submit. And that's where God was trying to transform Jacob's life, in that Jacob would be submissive to the will of God. And finally we see that as the day was breaking, he said, "Bless me. I won't let you go until you promise to bless me." And so we see that it goes into the next section, verses 27 through 29, and it was the title, or the name that was given. The angel of God, or the Christophany, says unto Jacob, he says, "What is your name?" He said, "My name's Jacob." Jacob meant what? Anybody remember?
Deceiver.
Deceiver, cheater, heel grabber. He was a deceiver. And now this is what happens. Verse 28, and he said, "Thy name shall be called no more Jacob the deceiver, but Israel. For as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and hast prevailed." Did he beat God? Did Jacob beat God? No. How did he prevail? He prevailed in his submission to God. And God changes his name to Israel, which means struggled with God, or fights with God, struggled with God. Isn't it interesting that Jacob the deceiver left Canaan 20 years before? And just before he crosses the Jordan, goes back into Canaan, God transforms him and changes his name to Israel, one who struggles with God. And as he said, "Thou hast power with God and with men." And so it's an interesting thing. God wanted to transform him so that as he went back into Canaan, he was going to be a different man and fulfill the divine plan that God had already promised to Abraham and Isaac. And it's interesting that as we see through the rest of the Old Testament and even into the New Testament, what's the phrase that we often hear of? The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or Israel. And we see that the 12 tribes of Israel, that one that was Jacob, and now we see is Israel, one who struggled with God and finally submitted unto him. And so we see that this is what takes place. And Jacob asked, he said, "Well, what is your name? What is your name?" And verse 29, and the angel of the Lord said, that basically said, "You know everything about me that you need to know right now at this moment of time." And didn't say any more. But we see that Jacob, as Israel, is now going to mature. And he goes into the promised land that God had already promised to give him and his descendants. And we see the venue there in verses 30 through 32. "And Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, For I've seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. It was interesting that he would name this the face of God, Peniel. It was a situation that Jacob was always going to remember this time. It's interesting as you notice the different landmarks in Jacob's life that he could point back to. He points back to Bethel as he was fleeing his brother Esau. And then we come as he's coming back, and that there's the one in chapter 31 that a marker set between he and Laban. He's going to remember that marker too. But now we see another marker that's set up here at Peniel. And this is going to be a very important moment in his life. How many times in our lives, as we look back into our lives, what are some of the markers that come up in our lives? Markers that point to, when you look and you say, only by the grace of God did this take place in my life. It's interesting. I can see back in my life where God took a very active part to transform my life at just the right moment to get me going down the path that he wanted me to go. How many times do people fight God instead of going down and surrendering and being submissive to him? But instead they will fight against God. But I can see points in my life where God transformed my life, and I submitted to him. And I wouldn't be here today if it were not for those different markers in my life. Jacob is seeing some of these same things in his life now. But it was interesting that in verse 32 it talked about that when God touched Jacob's thigh, it threw it out of joint. And here it said that therefore the children of Israel eat not of the sinew which shrank, which is upon the hollow of the thigh unto this day, because he touched the hollow of Jacob's thigh in the sinew that shrank. From that day on, Jacob limped. He had a limp. He would, later on we see here in the book of Genesis, he would lean upon his staff. It was interesting as we see that it was always in Jacob's memory. I remember when this happened. And as a result, as Moses was writing this, a book of Genesis, he said, up until this day, the children of Israel won't eat the thigh meat from the animal because of remembering what God did with Jacob. It was not in the dietary restrictions that God put out in the Ten Commandments and following, but it was something that the rabbinical priest put in the Talmud, and up until this time that Moses was writing, this was something that the children of Israel did out of respect, remembering that marker in Jacob's life. Once again, I think it's important as we look at Jacob and see that God had to transform him before he could really use him. Jacob had lived his life as deceitful, as cheating. He had been scheming, and now he finally submitted unto God. And from that point on, God was going to use him in a great way to accomplish his will. And that's what we need to realize even in our lives today, is that we need to submit ourselves unto God and allow him to transform our lives to do his will and accomplish that perfect will. Okay, I hope you enjoy.
Just a couple of things.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, and I will confess to not having read the lesson either here or in the book yet. But I will tell you that I think a case can be made, and I've read the case being made, that this is actually the point of Jacob's salvation.
Yes. There's some thought of that.
Yeah, and it specifically related to the fact that it's what you were saying. I thought maybe you were gonna go ahead and go off the cliff.
Okay.
But especially with the thought that as Jacob wrestled with him, there's no question that God could prevail at any time and put a stop to it. But what he wanted Jacob to understand was that God was God, and that and Jacob had to voluntarily submit. The thigh was the place in which Jacob said, "Wait a minute, this is way outside my ability to do anything." And yet God said he prevailed with him. And when he asked him his name, he was not given a name.
No.
But don't separate those two verses, because the very next verse is where he says, "The place I'm at is Peniel, face to face with who?
God.
God." So that is when he recognized, back at Bethel, he said, "This is the house of God. This is the gate of heaven." You know, but now he is saying, "I have seen him face to face. I know who he is. I know who he is, and I know that it's only by his mercy." That's the limp. It's only by his mercy that I have anything that I'm going to do. So I personally, when I teach this lesson, I am definitely I'm personally heading down that track, because I'm convinced personally that this is the place. And I'm not telling you got to be convinced of that, but I'm saying that I am, and it seems really clear to me that he acknowledges who God is at that moment. And this was as much a point of he prevailed with God. Criswell says something interesting in here. He says, the truth for all of us is, it is in surrender that we're victorious.
Right.
It is in submission that we are saved. It's not by standing up and claiming anything. We wrestle, when we wrestle with God too, but it's more God moving us to where he wants us to be.
Was that what Bethel was?
Yeah, I fully believe that's what it was. He had to have Bethel because...
Yeah, because up to this time, it's still not God's or Jacob's God.
No.
The God of his father.
Grandfather.
He needed Bethel because he just left everything behind, and he needed to be reminded what the blessing was.
Yeah.
He needed to be reminded about
And now he comes and he has all this wealth, but he has to still realize, no, God's in charge.
It's still God.
Yeah.
It's still God.